with Scott Allen.
Hello, I am your host, Scott Allen, and this is Phronesis, Practical Wisdom for Leaders. If the topic is leadership, I'm in. I've spent more than 20 years in the field teaching, learning, writing, and questioning. When I'm not working on Phronesis, I travel, delivering keynotes, working with individuals and teams, and helping people from organizations across industries become better leaders. Want to learn more? Visit me at scottjallen.net. Phronesis offers a smart, fast-paced discussion about all things leadership. We explore relevant topics and incorporate practical tips to help you make a difference in how you lead and live. Listen Notes lists Phronesis in the top 3% of podcasts worldwide. Phronesis is the official podcast of the International Leadership Association. ILA brings together those who teach, study, and develop leadership, advancing leadership knowledge and practice for a better world. Learn more at ila-net.org. Finally, if you enjoy Phronesis, please subscribe to stay current on our weekly episodes. If you find an episode that resonates, please share it with your colleagues and friends. And if you want more content, subscribe to my newsletter, The Leader's Edge. The link is in the show notes. As always, thanks for listening. And now, here's today's show. Okay, everybody, welcome to the Phronesis podcast. Thanks for checking in wherever you are in the world. Today, I'm excited for this conversation. We have Dr. Andrea Brownlow, newly minted doctor. Congratulations, doctor.
Thank you.
She is both a consulting and coaching psychologist and the founder of Berkeley Hall Associates, a small private practice dedicated to leadership development. Dr. Brownlow is also a part-time academic in the School of Psychology at the University of Sydney. She was awarded a university postgraduate scholarship in 2017 and completed her Ph.D. at the University of Sydney in 2022 under the supervision of Dr. Michael Kavanagh and Dr. Sean O'Connor and Dr. Helen Parker. So her thesis, or if you're in the United States, her dissertation is titled Measuring Adult Development and Exploring Its Relationship with Leadership, Parallel Journeys Through the Lens of Constructive-Developmental Theory. Andrea also holds a Master of Science in Coaching Psychology and Bachelor of Science in Psychology with first-class honors from the University of Sydney and a Bachelor of Business in Organisational Studies from Queensland's University of Technology. Andrea and her husband, Mark, live in Sydney, Australia, and are parents to two very active and wonderful teenagers. Dr. Brownlow, thank you so much for being with us today. What else do listeners need to know about you? What else can you share?
Well, first of all, Scott, thank you very much for inviting me on. I'm very honoured, having seen that your list of guests over the last, how long is it that you've been
couple
doing
years,
this?
A couple of years now.
Yeah, I feel very honoured. So, look, I don't know, how long have you got? So, it goes way back. So,
It goes way back.
So, if we go right back, my first job was as an equestrian coach. So in a lot of respects, I've come full circle.
Wow.
So, yes. So instead of coaching people on horses, I just coach the people, not the horse bit now. So, so that was my first career, was equestrian coaching. And I trained in the UK, and I didn't go to university until much later. And that's when I, having run my own business, and that's where I started out doing a business degree. And for me, I did the sort of the plain vanilla, accounting commerce pathway, which was actually very dull, I've got to say. But I was working full time and studying part time. So, I was quite enjoying the intellectual, challenge. But about 2/3 of the way through the degree, I realized that I should actually be doing psychology. So that was sort of the bit where I started to get really interested in human behavior. So I finished off that business degree and started another one, again, part-time, so working full-time. And that's how I sort of got into this particular area, was working in businesses, leading businesses, studying part-time, and then took a gap decade to have a couple of children, working all the way. As you
a gap decade, I love that.
A gap decade. I thought it might be a gap couple of years, but it was a gap decade after my honours. And so that's when I, started my private practice and sort of started doing more on the coaching side of things, more on the development side of things. And so that's sort of how it all started.
Hmm. Well, okay, a couple things on that. So I worked full time through every one of my degrees. So much
Right.
respect without not with children too. So much
Right.
respect for that dimension of this whole endeavor that you've been undertaking. But then also, I don't know if they have this in Australia, but in the States, there's kind of pockets of equine leader development.
Oh,
Have you seen
no,
this? Okay,
no.
using horses as a
Yes.
medium to get to elements of leader development. And so there's this
Wow.
pocket of people who are
Okay.
now I'm sure you've heard of like equine therapy, correct?
Yes, absolutely. Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
So it would be an offshoot a little bit of that, but I found myself, gosh, this must be 12, 13 years ago
Hmm.
with a group of students at a facility, and a facilitator was making connections between horses
Right.
and leader development.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
really interesting. So I guess I'd be kind of qualified.
Yes.
Wow. That's something else I can do.
I think here, now you heard it here first, everybody. What we can do is take the thinking of Robert Keegan and Bill Torbert, and we can use the horse to determine an individual's mental complexity, right? The stage of adult development that they're in. Maybe that's where we will take this.
I'm sure Bob Keegan would be fascinated. Oh, that's very funny.
Well, okay, so I was so excited when I think I heard about your dissertation from Deb Helsing at Minds at Work. And
Right.
she said, hey, there is this person in Australia doing some really cool stuff. And really, that's why we're here today, is to introduce listeners to some of what you've been working on for the last few years, which I think is so absolutely wonderful. And maybe what we do is just start off with just a general scope of your dissertation or your thesis. And
Okay.
then from there, maybe what are one or two findings that we can kind of pique listeners' interests with? I think
Hmm.
what through that process really stood out for you that was interesting. So let's start with kind of that general scope of the project, because it's cool.
Okay.
It's very
Okay.
cool.
Good. Okay. Thank you. Um, what I'd like to mention is the PhD was the first time I'd actually ever been a full-time student. That was just so exciting for me to actually just have one thing to focus on. I mean, there was still obviously family as a priority, but in terms of a job, what I decided to do was, rather than trying to do my PhD part-time, which you possibly did, I thought, you know what, I've done so much part-time study. I just want to be able to immerse myself in this project. And I'm so glad I did, because as it was, it took me nearly 5 years. So still doing bits and pieces of work along the way, but really trying to focus on the PhD. And so I suppose in a way that was it really gave me the time to, it probably ended up being bigger than I thought it was going to be. Basically, it kind of took on a life of its own. So I initially started out wanting to work on a measure of adult development. So one of my supervisors, and I think maybe in the States you call them advisors. So my primary advisor, Michael, had started work on a measure about a decade earlier, maybe not quite a decade, hadn't really progressed with it. And he said, well, look, are you interested? And I'd done a pilot project on it the year before when I was doing the coaching psychology masters, because Sydney University were, pretty tough about letting people go on to do a PhD if their prior research degree was, a little bit too far back. So because it was 10 years for me, I needed to sort of prove that I could, still do the research. So I
Sure.
did a pilot project, and again, been introduced to adult development through the coaching psychology unit. And so I was, of course, once I'd learned a little bit about adult development, I was absolutely hooked. That was it. I decided through the pilot project that I would actually make this measure of adult development the central part of my thesis. So that was my intention. And then I got underway. Now, in Australia, we don't do any coursework with our PhDs. It's all research. Yeah.
Really?
Yeah. although it's slowly changing, in the last probably 12 or 18 months, they've just sort of flipped that around, and there's a little bit of coursework involved. But when I started mine in 2017, it was all purely research, which is the way it's been for a long, long time. So you don't have a lot of contact with other students. Pretty much, you've got a free rein, which is good and bad. But one of the things that we used to do was once a week we go along to seminars and learn from the research students. And a lot of the clinical research students had to do a systematic review. And I didn't know a lot about systematic reviews. Of course, I knew what they were, but I had no idea of the process. And when I went to a couple of presentations, I thought, that's really cool. I might do that first before I, really start working on the measure. I didn't know it was going to take me about 18 months to do it. But it actually turned out to be, I think, one of the most interesting parts of the thesis, from the point of view that I guess I was really curious about why there wasn't more research out there about adult development and leadership, that understanding sort of the relevance of adult development. So I was quite, I guess really what I set out to do was to try and work out, is there, what kind of an evidence base is there out there for the relationship between adult development and leadership. So it took me 18 months all up. Now, I was a little bit slow because it was a process of discovery. And of course, my supervisor had never done a systematic review. And so I had to go through the whole process of learning. And that's kind of the fun part about doing a PhD. Fun and painful is that you actually have to, work things out as you go along.
Yes.
Yeah, I got really interested in this systematic review. And I think I started out with about 3,500 studies, papers. And I decided with my search criteria that I wanted to focus really on empirical studies. So not theoretical papers, they needed to be empirical studies. So anyway, to cut a long story short, it took a long time, but I think we got that down to about 70 studies. So the systematic review takes up chapter 2 of the thesis. But for me, I think, and I'm working on actually trying to publish that at the moment. So I'm close, hopefully a couple of weeks off sending that away somewhere. So for me, I think it was a really useful way to start the PhD. And I think there's some really interesting findings in there.
Well, and I have to imagine, Andrea, that this landscape, I mean, it's a little bit confusing, especially when you start to jump in, because there's even the terminology, ego development, you've got people using all kinds of different mental complexity, stages of development, levels of development. I mean,
that's right.
What were some observations you had, even as you got down to that 70? I mean, it's just interesting, right?
Yes. I think, look, you kind of had to be brutal to get it down to the 70. And I started out with a lot more. And so I went through several iterations to kind of try and narrow it down. And even when I did that, I still ended up with 70 really quite very different papers, very broad. So what I did was I used set search terms to begin with. So I think that helped to narrow it down a little bit. If I was going to do it again, I'd possibly use even more search terms. So, for example, ego development, which I didn't use. I use very specific search terms, and I think that did help. But yes, I mean, and this is why a systematic review takes such a long time, is you need to really read through each paper to see whether it does fit with your research questions. And of course, some of them don't, and so they don't stay in. But yes, a lot of the language was quite confusing, and so you've got papers where you've got where they're using Jane Lovinger's measure or Torbert's measure, and then you've got other papers using the SOI, Keegan's measure. Again, you've got to make decisions about, which papers are going to stay within that, that final studies. But yes, the terminology is quite confusing. There's meaning making, and there's, like you say, mental complexity, and so
frames of mind.
Yes, frames.
I have a list. Exactly. Maybe I can pull it up for the end of our conversation. But so listeners have an appreciation of what you sifted through. So what were some findings when you got down to the 70? What were some things that stood out for you there? I mean, as opportunities?
That's a really good question, Scott. So there were so many great things that came out of the review. And I guess at the sort of the high level sort of end of things, I couldn't believe how few published studies there were that were looking at adult development in the context of leadership. And I think all up, there's something like 40 dissertations included in the final 70 papers. So there's a lot of unseen research out there. That really surprised me. So, I mean, it's good and bad. It's great that the research is there. And once I got going, that was, I guess, was a driver for me in terms of, well, this is really worthwhile because I can make this research visible, hopefully. So there was only something like, I think it was about 26 or 27 published papers that were really looking at adult development and leadership together. And it's really, we're talking about 40 years of research. So that really surprised me a lot. But I think it also explains why, it's a bit of I guess there's a little bit of a vicious circle in the sense that because a lot of that research is unseen, other researchers don't know what's out there. They don't know what to build on. They don't know what the base is. But there is an evidence base, and I think it's a pretty substantial evidence base that demonstrates how important adult development is to leadership. Yeah, and there's quite a diversity of studies too, I mean, in that systematic review. So there's studies that are looking at those sort of studies from the education sector, from sort of more corporate, professional areas. There's studies on sustainability and looking at really sort of quite advanced leaders who are very successful in the sustainability space. And the leaders that are really effective are those leaders that are at much later stages of adult development. So there's a whole, range of studies covering all sorts of areas. Some of the more, I guess, detailed findings are probably around the fact that growth and development is a really slow process. It doesn't just happen after a 3-month leadership development program.
Yes.
We're talking can take years. Now, that's not to say that a really effective 12-month leadership development program won't bring about change, because there are a number of studies in the systematic review, that actually demonstrate that does happen. But it tends to happen at lower levels of development, earlier stages of development. So, for example, using Keegan's framework, it's easier for a leader at, say, stage 3 to shift than somebody at stage 4, for example. And that was a really consistent finding across all of the studies. It's much easier for leaders at earlier stages of development to shift.
Because, when I think of just even, this is just for my own interest and interest of listeners potentially, but when I think of at least the little I've explored the space, and I have not explored the dissertations to the degree, in any way, shape, or form that you have, mostly just the published work. But it seems to me that Carl Kunert and his colleagues, oftentimes his students, really has kind of the most energy in the business space, at least. And then there's some from the Center for Creative Leadership, but is there any other pocket that you found where you said, wow, this person, in Bangladesh is doing, there's a base here, or was it just kind of scattershot all over sector, space, no one really gaining any kind of consistent long-term traction? Is that accurate?
I think it is accurate, Scott, and I wish there was a pocket, like a really solid base out there, and there's not. And I think that's largely because a lot of this research is unseen, it's invisible.
Yes.
Because a lot of it's unpublished. So hopefully that's what the review will, I'm hoping that it will generate a little bit of interest and go, oh, okay, I can build on this piece of research, or I could build on that piece of research, because that's one of the critiques or the criticisms, is that it's a very disparate body of research. I think 40 years, there's so little research published out there. I think obviously Bill Torbett is another one. He's done a lot of work in that space, but it really is, it's a core group of researchers that have produced this quite disparate body of research.
And that's why I was so excited about your dissertation, because I believe wholeheartedly that this can become a base camp for people from which to then do their own exploration, because this work that you have pulled together, in my mind, will be a seminal piece of work moving forward for anyone who's passionate about the topic. And so I just have so much respect, because pulling that together and doing, literally you were hunting and gathering.
Yes, thanks, Scott. It was like that too. Fishing.
Yes, you were fishing.
I was fishing.
I mean, I just have so much. So, okay, so that's a really interesting finding. So it may be more, it may be easier to help people, shift at earlier stages of development. Were there any
Mhm.
other findings that stood out for you as you kind of looked at what's been found so far?
Well, I mean, the general agreement is that adult development is very hard to measure. I mean, no surprises there, but consistently through all the research, everybody, and it didn't matter whether they'd use the SOI, Bob Keegan's measure, or whether they'd use the sentence completion test, the general consensus was it's very difficult to measure adult development. And
Hmm.
it requires, even if you've done the certification process, it requires a high degree of expertise. It's very labor intensive. And with the SOI, for example, I think, you have to have two people scoring the interviews. So first you have to have the skill to be able to do the interviews, and then you've got to have a couple of very good scorers. So the other end of my thesis or my dissertation, the sixth study that I did was actually a small study, a qualitative study. So it was 8 SOIs with 8 quite senior leaders. And so I was very fortunate in that I was able to have Nancy Pop's help, Dr. Nancy Pop,
Oh,
who
wow, good.
yeah, so Nancy was my expert scorer, and the only reason I knew about Nancy was through the systematic review, and I kept in all the acknowledgement sections of all these dissertations, I kept seeing Nancy Pop, and I thought, who is this person? Like, she sounds amazing. So I tracked her down. If I could get Nancy to be my second scorer and to teach me some more about the SOI, that would be wonderful. And I did. So that was a real highlight for me, was actually working with Nancy. And Nancy said, well, look, I can just score them for you. Or at the other end, we can do some coaching. And I said, look, I'm all for the coaching because I really want to hone my skills. So yeah, Nancy very thoroughly coached me on
Andrea,
on the
how
scoring.
so? Okay, I'm going to put a couple links to a podcast episode between Keith Eigel and Nancy Pop. She did a couple
Right.
conversations with Keith Eigel, so I'll put those in the show notes for listeners, just so you can get a sense of who Nancy Pop is. And we've used the
Terrific.
term SOI a couple times in the
Mhm.
context of this
Yes.
conversation for listeners. Subject object interview. It's the protocol for assessing an individual's developmental stage according to
Mhm.
Keegan's model. And as Andrea said, there's the what is it, the Washington University sentence completion test.
Yes, that's it. Jane Lovinger's measure. Yes.
Yes, yeah. So there's a few different that are out there, but I will put some links in there. How close were you with Nancy's assessments?
Oh, I'm glad you asked me that, Scott.
Because
So
she's
half of
probably
them,
one of the best in the world at this point,
she
right?
is.
Yeah.
She is the most expert of the experts. She was so Nancy was, in on the SOI from day one. She's fantastic. She's so knowledgeable. I was pretty close with about half of them, or close, or on the money with half of them. Now we're not talking a big sample, thank goodness. It was only 8.
Yes.
But the other 4, I definitely scored them higher than Nancy.
Huh.
And so it really demonstrated to me how important it is to have a second scorer who's an expert scorer. So I've done the certification process, and I've probably done about 40 odd SOIs.
Yeah.
So I'm pretty familiar with them. You really do need somebody else who, if you want to get an accurate assessment of someone's level of adult development, you really need to have an expert scorer. So the other 4, mine were a bit high. Nancy very patiently schooled me
Yes.
and showed me how they weren't quite that high. So I think for me, because I'd done all the interviews as well, and because I knew the backgrounds of some of these leaders, I think I was really in the zone of assuming that they were at slightly later stages of development. I think
Mm.
that's probably what influenced my scoring to a degree, because all 8 leaders were in really very senior roles, and some of them managing billion-dollar budgets, and we're talking very senior leaders. And so I almost had this sort of automatic assumption that, yes, they must be around that stage 4 order
Mm.
of development. So that's quite an advanced stage of development. Of all of those 8 interviewees, they were all at different stages. So, yeah, the most developmentally advanced leader was around stage 4. And we had a leader who was actually below stage 3, which really took me by surprise.
Wow.
So that was interesting.
Well, and for listeners, I think something, and Andrea, please push back if you disagree with the statement I'm about to make. But, the thinking is that individuals at different levels of development will kind of construct the role of leader differently, and
Yes,
may enact their authority in different ways depending on how they're making sense of the world.
yes.
And Carl Kunert, was it 1985? I forget what year it was, Andrea, but he wrote an article about transformational leadership applying Keegan's work, Kunert and Lewis, I believe it was.
Yes, yes, 87, I think. Yes,
87. Okay,
yes.
I was somewhere in
I
there.
think,
We're geeking
yeah,
out right now.
that's right.
But, really kind of one of the first just beginning to hypothesize, well, how would a leader at this stage kind of construct the role and make meaning of it? So that's interesting. That's really interesting.
Mm. Yeah, it's quite fascinating because, and the other probably interesting part from that final study in the thesis was the fact that these leaders that are that sort of stage 3/stage 4, where they're operating from sort of two orders of development, they were quite stressed. And so that was quite an interesting finding. They were really quite in over their heads, as Keegan's, obviously the name of Robert Keegan's second book, In Over Our
Yes.
Heads. Now, these leaders were still moderately effective. They were still quite good at their jobs, but I think they really had to work very hard at being good at their jobs because they really didn't have that level of, independent thinking that was
Yeah.
required for them to be really effective. And so there was quite a common theme with these leaders who weren't at that fully self-authoring stage of development. They struggled with conflict. They, had a desire to please their colleagues and their subordinates. They were sort of quite keen for others' approval.
Mm,
They were really looking to meet other people's expectations rather than setting their own goals per se based on their experience and their knowledge. So the confidence levels differed quite significantly between those leaders that sort of in the middle, between stages 3 and 4, and then those couple of leaders that were really around that stage 4 level. There was quite a difference in their self-confidence that
mm.
really came through in the interviews too.
So, Andrea, and as we kind of begin to wind down our conversation, I have
Mm-hmm.
one final area that I'd love to explore with you just to see what you found when it comes to helping people kind of along that journey. Were there pedagogical interventions? Were there sources of learning that you came across in the literature? Again, that could be critical reflection. It could be, were there elements of programming that helped people begin the habits of mind or move along the process of development? Any indicator of that in the studies that you explored?
From the systematic review, there were a range of things that helped to really successfully sort of for people to grow. And it was things like experiential learning, so
Hmm.
field trips. So field trips that really cause people to sort of question their assumptions around things. But again, the experiential learning needed to be followed up in the classroom with critical reflection, with support, and with a good holding environment. So that was another factor that came out of another sort of finding that came out of the systematic review was that obviously holding environment makes a big difference to ongoing growth and development. And so a holding environment can be as simple as, so for somebody younger, can be a school environment, or for an adult, it can be their organisation. And then there were quite a number of studies that were looking at coaching as a holding environment as well.
Okay.
And coaching was found to be, again, it comes through as being quite consistently effective at supporting people's development. And that came out of the final study as well with the 8 leaders that I did. A consistent theme from them, and they are in the process of doing a 12-month leadership development program, and coaching was a big component of that program. And that was consistently mentioned by each of the coachees in terms of being a significant factor for them in helping them to grow. And they felt that like they had changed to a certain extent. And the measure that I developed in the middle part of the thesis, the 4 studies, did actually show that most of those leaders did grow to a degree. So coaching was found to be very effective. There was a Canadian study on a mindfulness program, a 12-month mindfulness program that was actually successful in producing some change, some developmental growth. I think they used a sentence completion test in that study from memory. Things like, so shared leadership, for example, promoting diversity and change in the organisation, shared decision-making, things like cross-cultural programs, internships, all those things that take people out of their comfort zone seem to really support growth and development. But again, those things in isolation don't necessarily work unless people have the support, say, either back in the classroom or with a coach, for example. So you need to provide that holding environment that not just challenges, but also supports people as well. So it's about having that right balance of support and challenge, I think, is a huge factor.
Okay. Well, that's really, really interesting. I'm Dave, who you have met. We're working on a paper right now, and
yes,
I would love to send it to you to get your own thinking and perspective on,
right,
because we're very interested in that. Keegan and Leahy and Associates had written the book about, an everyone culture, deliberately developmental organizations. And something we're interested in is, how do you design deliberately developmental degrees where, again, we can get people at least on the path of, the habits of mind that will provide them with opportunities for growth and development. And so I think it's just a really interesting conversation. If we agree with the general notion that leaders at elevated levels of mental complexity will be more successful, generally speaking, in tackling these very complex roles. To your point, maybe if they're self-authored, they'll experience less stress because they'll work out of a place of their own principles and values and worldview.
Right.
Then how do we help people in that process? How do we build those habits of mind, right? And I think sometimes we've been talking about, sometimes our degrees, at least when it comes to the topic of leadership, we put people in a room and we teach them the history.
Yes, that's right. Yes.
But to not provide them with the tools to get on the path to be more successful, tackling these just really challenging roles, right?
And I think that's where the experiential learning comes in too.
Yes.
It's about going out there, going out into the field. It's about things like placements and short internships and exposure, and it's mentoring. So coaching and mentoring was such a big thing. Even things like peer coaching. Peer coaching can work really well in a classroom setting where, you mightn't have the budget for everybody to have an executive coach. But peer coaching groups seem to work really well in terms of providing that level of support that's needed for growth as well. And also in terms of critical reflection. So the peer coaching works well, as it suits most budgets.
Yes.
and longer term and longer term programs. So, you'd know too, Scott, that there's quite a strong correlation between education and stage of development. So education is a really important factor in development. And again, with this measure that forms the middle part of the thesis, and that was a consistent correlation as well. I had samples of, I think, 500 in one study and 300 in the other, and it was a consistent finding that there is a positive correlation between level of education and development. So just education in itself is a key factor, I think. It seems to be.
Again, I'm just so thankful for the work that you have done. And I know that it is going to impact so many scholars in so many really positive ways. And so I'm going to put a link to, I believe we can put a link to the thesis, and I would love for that work to be known. And I think it's just, again, I'm going to call it a base camp. It's just a go-to space, because as someone who's tried to begin to gather some of these pieces of work myself, wow, it's complex. So there's that. So thank you. I always close out the conversation by asking guess what they've been listening to or reading or streaming, and it may have something to do with what we've just discussed. It may have nothing to do with what we've discussed. But what comes to mind for you? What's caught your attention in recent times?
I've got to say, I haven't been reading very much. And this is completely off track. My son's in his final few weeks of high school. So,
Okay.
it's a really big deal. And what they do here is they finish at school and then they go away for about a month and they study, and then they go back to school for their final exams. So due to finish officially in about November, but he's sort of been working, and over the last month or two, he takes music for one of his subjects for high school. So I've been listening to a lot of really beautiful cello music. For me, it's just such a treat because I'm probably spending half my week working from home. So that's just such a treat to listen to that. It's just an absolute joy. So that's what I've been listening to a lot. And my son and daughter both play piano as well. So not quite leadership, not on the topic of leadership, but that's what I've been listening to and just loving and just, soaking it up.
Oh, that's wonderful. That's wonderful. We have a cellist in our house as well. Actually, two of them.
Do you?
Little,
Wonderful.
It may be less enjoyable at 12 and 14 than what you're experiencing at 18.
It's worth persevering with, Scott. It's just, I can so remember when they were, a lot younger, my guys, and just, and everybody would say to me, "You're so lucky they practice." And I'd say, "Well, no, it's not luck. I tell them they have to practice." So it's worth doing. We just said to them, "Hey, it's part of your education."
Yes.
So, and now they love it. They do it for the joy of it, not because they have to.
Well, and that's something they can do for life as well. So
absolutely.
That's wonderful. Well, Andrea, thank you so much for stopping by today. I really, really appreciate it. And all kinds of links in the show notes for listeners for you to tap into. Even if you just want to learn some basics around adult development, we'll have some resources in the show notes for you. So check those out. Thank you for the good work that you're doing. Good luck as you work to publish this. That's a whole new endeavor.
It is. That's one word for it. Thank you very much for having me. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Scott.
What an absolute joy to speak with Dr. Andrea Brownlow and really kind of explore her work. Again, as I mentioned a couple times in the podcast episode, I just believe that this can be a very, very important piece of literature to help people understand the space, help people think about and think through their own research based on what her findings were. And so, Dr. Brownlow, thank you so much for the good work that you're doing. I do believe it's going to make a difference. The practical wisdom for me is do what you love, explore, investigate. And that is exactly what she has been up to for a good period of time now, if I remember correctly. Do what you love and be curious and explore. Everybody, I hope you have a great day. As you know, the ILA is coming up. There's some links in the show notes. And there's also another learning experience with the Prometheus Project to explore the immunity to change process through Minds at Work. Incredible work by Bob Keegan, Lisa Leahy and Associates, Deb Helsing. Just well worth your time to explore. As always, take care, be well. Thanks for checking in, and we'll see you next week. Bye-bye. You have just finished another episode of Practical Wisdom for Leaders with Scott Allen. To contact me, visit scottjallen.net or send me a note at scott@scottjallen.net. I'm also on LinkedIn, so let's connect. If you have feedback, I'd love to hear it. And as always, thank you so much for listening. And now here's my daughter, Emily, with the outro.
You've been listening to Phronesis, Practical Wisdom with Scott Allen.